we're seeing just really, really, really difficult to cope with impacts that we didn't even necessarily think we might cause. Sometimes it's an adaptive management approach where we put in the state-of-the-art approach that we know to do at the time. So in the 1950s and 60s, as a lot of these parks are starting to get busy, or even just being founded for the first time, created, they did their best at that point, but they didn't know a whole lot, right? The field of wildlife biology and zoology, thanks to folks like Aldo Leopold, is on the order of just decades old, right? Versus some other disciplines, professions like chemistry, for example, that's centuries old and has roots back in alchemy, like 1,000 years ago, trying to turn anything they could into gold, because gold is good, I guess, and so forth, right? So forestry is a relatively young profession. Park management is younger still. In fact, ecologically based park management really only got started in the mid-1960s. So we're still kind of laying the track as we're rolling the train out. We are figuring some things out as we go. And sometimes the cave systems that we are managing are our early warning indication systems, our canary in the coal mine to explain to us, hey, there are more negative impacts to human presence in these places than we first knew about. So for the next generation of management following the 60s and 70s, into the 80s and 90s for second generation stuff, into the aughts and teens and today for like third and fourth generation park management, now we have a much more complete picture of what this list of impacts and the rate of these impacts and how much it costs, how much work it is, how much sweat equity it is to fix or prevent these things these days. Okay? So, with a Karst system, we're looking at it as a whole river, complete with species, complete with flow dynamics, complete with seasonal and annual and decadal variations. So decadal variations is on the order of tens of years, decade. And somebody who is not even inside the border of your national park, like adjacent to or up to 70 miles away from Ozark Scenic Riverways, which has hundreds of karst cave entrances just in that tiny little ribbon of a national park. If there's like the family farm's trash pit, well, all that stuff is going somewhere. All the stuff that's dissolved out of that trash, maybe that 100-year-old trash, is going somewhere. Very commonly here in the Midwest, we have the surface impression of a karst ecosystem, a limestone or limestone-like geology-based ecosystem that looks like, purely on a topographic sense, it looks like either a World War I battlefield with it's just a whole bunch of craters, or the surface of the moon with a whole bunch of craters. And each one of those craters is not a crater at all. It's not an impact wound of any kind. It is instead where a cave collapsed and created a sinkhole. And by definition, all the water that is now in this new micro watershed is going to go down that sinkhole and flow through that cave system. So if you're throwing your trash, and again, this is a widespread cultural practice. We're not going to sit in judgment on these people. This is how they knew to exist 100 years ago. Before we had weekly trash service and we were landfilling stuff and hopefully containing all of the toxic chemicals and so forth in those landfills by lining them with plastics and so forth, the best that people knew to do was, like, when your washing machine stops washing, tractor it out to the sinkhole and just leave it there, and eventually it'll rust out and sort of reincorporate into the soil, I guess. That was the best that people knew to do, all right? And that's very unfortunate, and we are going to be paying for that legacy the rest of our lives, but that's what they knew to do at the time. Okay, so similarly with septic tank drain fields, where we have essentially concentrated fecal matter, which is going to be very, very high in nitrogen and very high in human hormones like synthetic birth control hormones, and for men on hormone replacement testosterone or human growth hormone or whatever, right? all of this stuff, even at very low concentrations, can fairly intensively disrupt aquatic cave wildlife, in particular amphibians. And so this kind of stuff, think about all the synthetic flavorings and the perfumes, synthetic ester molecules, and so on and so forth, synthetic color molecules that are passing through your body and being voided in your from your bowels or as urine, that pass through because they are synthetic. Your body isn't evolved or adapted or designed, depending on your theology, to break down those molecules. This is how we get 0-calorie sweeteners. They just pass through your body, right? Well, those go somewhere, right? After you poop or pee them out, they still exist. And so even just a septic tank drain field is a highly concentrated source of anthrogens, human-based chemicals, typically synthetic chemicals. So if you think of even just all the chemicals we put down a toilet, right? So if you've ever lived in a house where there was like one of those chlorine bleach pucks stuck in the tank or whatever, with every flush you get the little blast of chlorine gas and it keeps anything from growing in the tank, well, that water's going somewhere. And if it's going out of a septic tank, then a septic leach field, for example, if that's anywhere near a cave system, it's going into the cave system. Okay? And we do a lot of these days at a fairly large scale in some places where it is visible from space, or detectable from space anyway, with radar ranging. When we do major earthworks, like regrading, for example, so putting in an earthwork, a dike, a dam, a levee, that's radically altering how water flows over the surface of the earth, and then consequently how water can flow through any associated cave systems connected to those watersheds and connected to those aquifers. And so we build a bunch of levees on the Mississippi River to hold back the Mississippi. We channelize it. We make intensive flood problems, but we save a bunch of farm fields depending on where you are. And we create new cave systems, or we starve off existing cave systems from the flow that they've been getting for thousands of years, sort of undisturbed or unmolested. And so miles and miles away, we're getting impacts. We're getting our oxygen hose stepped on, so to speak, if you want to think of the water flowing through the cave system as that ecosystem's oxygen. It is more than just oxygen, of course, but dissolved oxygen is part of it. So this is a big deal, right? All this to say, a lot of the impacts to a cave system may not have anything to do with your decisions and your ability to affect and manage and put into place your understanding, your park hydrologist's understanding of how is this system supposed to function naturally. So cave ecosystem restoration is much, much, much harder than forest restoration ecology, for example. You have to get a whole lot more people to help out and play along and agree with what the ologists, your hydrologists, your cave biologists, your speleologists, your cave scientists, and so forth, right? And then if we're drilling wells nearby, a lot of people in rural areas live on well water, and to the extent that we're doing farming near any of these places, like on all sides of Ozark Scenic Riverways, big and small, right? When you have an incision well, so if we're looking side on, this is the surface of the earth, trees and houses and deep well. As you start pulling water out of this well to spray it on top of your farm field, you are creating and altering the vector field of where water wants to flow. Water goes from areas of high pressure, high potential, to areas of low pressure. So if we suck out all the water from the rock matrix at this well, if we have a cave system over here, right, and maybe the lower gallery of the cave is filled with water, this person's farm field is going to drain this underground lake. So for those of you who are on the field trip over to Ozark Scenic Riverways, when we stopped at Devil's Well, that underground or that cave lake system, that's not the only one in the area. And humans have radically altered the height of the water table, the availability of water and of hydrostatic pressure so to keep all this where it is with crazy intensive well use, right? We've been using so much fossil water that NASA has measured the change to the Earth's gravity field from space over the southwestern United States. Like, we are, capital S, screwing ourselves and future generations by using a whole lot more water than the planet can, a whole lot more fresh water than the planet can generate on a yearly basis. So we're writing that check that we can't cash out of things like well drilling, so that we can have almond milk, so that we can have fresh tomatoes in January, so that we can have all of the things that Western culture deems as important, and it may not be so, right? Cheap beef, or relatively cheap beef, for example. Instead of treating beef like a once or twice a month dessert, as some earlier cultures have, some of us, was it like 10% of Americans are eating like 80% of the beef? Like, that's a lot of beef. Man, ooh, God, the meat sweats, ooh. Anyway, live your best life. Anyway, so let's talk about more specifically within the class of cave resources, speleothems, so dripstone, so stalactites, stalagmites, those big sort of conical features that are trying to grow to each other and connect as columns. Soda straws, fairy castles, which are more sheet-like structures, and flowstone, which looks like a frozen waterfall typically, or a mudstone formation. These are all classed as speleothems by speleologists who are the science of caves people. So when visitors break these, because back in the day in the 1800s when cave tours were very popular among earlier United States folks, if you gave your cave guide an extra big tip, they would take you to rooms full of speleothems and help you break one off so you could take it home and stick it on your mantle above the fireplace or out on your front porch so people could walk by and go, how neat is that? And you say, pretty neat. To the extent that those are able to be repatriated, they very rarely are, or where one is broken off in place but not stolen. The plan is or the approach in terms of management of that impact is typically to drill like a 1-inch hole vertically through the segments that remain, pin it in place with an epoxy-coated steel rebar, or iron rebar. So just a bar of iron in that 1-inch wide cavity. Fill that cavity with epoxy and essentially glue the thing back together on a metal post. And then slather the whole thing with mud to hide the cracks and seams to remove that releaser cue of thinking, oh, somebody's broken this previously. And it's just a reconstructed speleothem. It's not a original natural one in this spot anymore. And the mud is the same color as everything else in that room in the cave, so that is a very effective camouflage. This is also good for, mud masking is very good for taking care of this, right? So at Mammoth Cave, the National Park Service does a really good job of helping us understand that it was once accepted cultural practice to carve a sign of your passage into the cave passage. In fact, this is specifically what a lot of cave guides did to sort of pad their tips a little bit better. Right? So if you gave them an extra big tip, they'd hand you a fresh candle, and you could use the soot of the candle not to scratch something in, but to sort of tattoo something on with the low combustion soot, the carbon black of that candle, onto any sort of horizontal surface overhead. So, 1820, 1851, right before the Civil War, and so on and so forth, right? A lot of people did this for a long time. And in any other context, we worked really hard at preventing graffiti. In this context, because these most of these historically are more than 50 years old. They are protected as cultural artifacts of previous humanity. But it's also a federal crime to add to this, right? So it's this weird sort of, not double standard, but moving window of what is considered acceptable, right? So there's so much of this. And this is a photo of much more recent stuff. How do we know? Because this is spray paint, which was not invented until like at least 5 or 6 years after 1851, right? So people, based on previous people's bad behavior, get the idea that psychological or behavioral psychological releaser cue to leave a mark behind. And have you guys ever read the label on a can of spray paint? Does anybody know what specific chemicals are almost always in a can of spray paint? Aside from like pigment particles. All right. So, in the chemical engineering world, people pay a whole lot of extra attention to a specific class of carbon-based molecules because they are extremely toxic. They are easy to move around. They're very labile and mobile. And this whole class of chemicals is abbreviated as the BTEX chemicals, the benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene families of chemicals. And these are really, really, really good so-called organic solvents, right? So you suspend paint particles, colored particles, little plastic particles, or back in the day they used to be organometallic particles, a little cobalt, blue, green for copper, white for titanium, etc. On down the list. And these days, like these are so damaging to humans that these are the ones who wear the double-sided full face or half face respirators with activated charcoal organic solvent filters to specifically remove these chemicals because they will they'll kill you early, and they'll screw up your kids if you ever have them. This stuff can pull apart DNA pretty well, for example. So, the fact that we have folks hiking these chemicals, which are highly concentrated, into these spray bottles, and then blasted out into this system, the impact isn't just where the spray paint is, it's all of everything around here that has a real thin dusting of benzene, toluene, xylene, ethylbenzene, the hundreds of chemical relatives of those four that are used as solvents, among other things, and kind of invisible until you come back the next year and you do your next amphibian inventory and you don't find any. And then it's too late, right? Because once those chemicals are in there, what are you going to do? Power wash the cave clean? That's not going to work, right? Where's all that power wash fluid going to drain? It's not. It's going to seep through this whole system. This is a flowing, wet cave system, right? That water goes somewhere, and it is highly polluted, right? So lots of examples of these issues. Here's a pinned speleothem. So this is a stalagmite. It might get up to the ceiling someday. And project cavers. So in the hierarchy of people who interact with caves, we have speleologists, people who are studying caves with science, project cavers, who are measuring, mapping caves, doing things like speleothem restoration and so forth. Then we have recreational cavers, who are enjoying caves in cave tours or just, on their own. For example, there are cavers who have been mapping out the Mammoth Cave system. They crossed the important milestone of over 400 miles of caves mapped, connected to the Mammoth Cave system. 400 miles. To the point that some of these new to-be mapped sections take a month of underground travel just to get to the starting point, and then a month back, right? Serious caving efforts, and logistics and safety needs. Like if you like rock climbing, think about getting into project caving, because holy cow, wow, you can see some stuff that literally nobody else has ever seen before. But they're doing stuff like this. And then the lowest level on the hierarchy of cavers are going to be spelunkers, which has evolved from a term of somebody who likes spelunking into a cave, just anybody who enjoys a cave recreationally, to now be a pejorative or a negative or an insulting term. The joke among cavers is that spelunk is the sound that a human body makes as it falls to the bottom of a deep cave gallery and goes spelunk or splat or just breaks. So don't be a spelunker. Right? And then finally, with places like Devil's Well, we saw at Ozark Scenic Riverways on the field trip, or you would see at Mammoth Cave, where there are elaborate walkways and stairs and all sorts of stuff to physically separate your footfalls from the fragile ground of the cave. Pretty cool stuff. Pretty expensive. Right? So in the most extreme cases where it is a confirmed active biological cave situation and confirmed heavy recreational use pressure, lots of people want to use it, and there are relatively few places you can go, so it's very intensively used in those places in the caves. That means you're building stainless steel stairs, you're welding them in place inside the cave, and you're generating the welding fumes, you have to power that welding equipment, etc. And think of all the metal shavings you have to create by grinding off the extra weld on those joints and so forth. It can cost $15,000 to $50,000 per stair step to put those in place. Because, man, if somebody's going to bite that bullet, you want to do it so nobody has to build any more stairs there for like ever. Right? So stainless steel, extra hard to work with in terms of welding and so forth. And every little metal filing has to be carefully caught with drop cloths and pulled out, and you have to have ventilation management for the fumes. So you have essentially ducted fan systems that are blowing all the way out to the outside of the cave, and you have to pay the very specialized teams of welders to do this stuff. Right? So $15,000 to $50,000 per stair step. That's a lot. And we don't generally think of most of our parks, especially our smaller parks, as having the kind of budget to do stuff like this. Right? So this is how the federal United States National Park Service tackles problems like this, where it's extremely fragile and it's extremely intensively loved or used by humans. We're going to take special appropriations from Congress, right? We're going to take entry fees or permit or activity fees from all across the national park system, and we're going to draw a little bit from everybody to get this system working at Mammoth Cave, for example, right? So everybody's going to pay a little bit of a tax, if you want to think of it that way, in order to get this place sort of stood up and running in a sustainable way. So that's a big deal. And I only bring that up and make such a big deal out of it because, you know, where the use is intensive, it is appropriate and ethical and right for the management response or preparation for that use to be just as intensive. Okay, so custom building stainless steel furniture and stair steps and stuff like that, that's not weird at all. If that's what it takes, then that's what we're going to do. All right, so here's what that looks like. All right, so here's exactly that this is one spot of Mammoth Cave, right? So we've got stairs, and every step is custom fitted to that specific spot. It takes a long time, super expensive, but there's no other way to have people running through that system. And a place like Mammoth Cave sees hundreds of thousands to millions of people a year. China recently opened some of its first national parks. And China, as large as it is, has a bunch of cave and rock formation-based national parks, just like we do. Except the intensity of the use in those places is an order of magnitude higher than here. So here in the United States, our busiest national parks, we're looking at like the 6 to 8 million visitors per year. In places like Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Yellowstone, Yosemite, right? Some of the big, well, best known crown jewel parks. 5, 6, 7, 8 million visitors a year. On year one of some of these Chinese national parks, one of which is through a cave system much like Mammoth, 25 million people on year one. And it took us a century to get to 6 to 8 million, right? So in that particular case, not just custom welded and assembled and fitted and designed on the fly, manufactured in place staircases, they have full-on moving sidewalks and government-run lodging, so sort of banks of hotels and fleets of 80-passenger buses, and the whole system is scheduled. So you wake up, and the Chinese National Park Service tells you your cave tour is at 8 a.m. You need to be on bus 118, and if you miss the bus, you're staying in your hotel room for this day, because this is what we have for you to do. You arrive to the cave entrance, go on the moving sidewalk through the cave, and then back to your bus and back to the hotel. Because that's the only way they're going to get 25 million living, breathing bodies through that space without it being utter pandemonium and chaos, as Jeff Foxworthy, the old "you might be a redneck" comedian, used to say. Okay? So, other resources, right? We have cave-adjacent species, so ones that we might find near sinkholes, entrances, grottos, so shallow caves where sunlight can penetrate to the back. It's a grotto for our purposes in this class. And then we have cave-obligate species. Okay, so blind cave fish, for example, they're not going to be able to outcompete sighted fish outside of their cave system, and typically they're there because they cannot get out. Right? The way that cave system's water courses are flowing, there's just no fish ladder for them to swim back up and out, for example. Cave fish and so forth, extremely, extremely, extremely adapted to that environment and the extreme nutrient poverty that most cave systems, the further deep you go, there's less and less organic material, period, for them to feed on, right? So some of them are almost closed ecosystems. So when we're running cave tours through there, if somebody, drops a crumb off of a power bar, that's a radical alteration to how many calories are in that pool total. Maybe more than that pool has ever had in the last couple of centuries. And it's just a crumb of difference. And it can set off this whole cascade that can either crank up and then lead to a collapse of the population, or poison a species that's not adapted to the synthetic excitotoxic flavoring chemicals, for example, in human foods. And that can depauperate the population locally as that pollution works its way through those organisms and so forth. So there's just, all this to say, there's limited buffering capacity. There's limited flexibility, or excess survival capacity for these creatures relative to the disturbance of running tourists or even well-meaning project cavers through these systems. Of course, with bats in particular, a native fungus that is common to caves in northern Europe, Scandinavia, or the Norse countries, for example, called Geomyces destructans. So geo for stone, caves. Myces is a root for fungus, and destructans is exactly what it sounds like, Geomyces destructans. Causes a disorder among bats, which for humans would be analogous to getting athlete's foot, or jock itch, or like a UTI fungal infection kind of a thing. Which for us humans and our antibiotics and antifungals, like maconazole nitrate, different topical antifungal stuff you put on the athlete's foot and it goes away after a couple of days. it's sort of irritating and funny, and you move on with your life. But for bats in the United States, in American cave systems, not adapted or adjusted to or able to cope with Geomyces destructans being transported by cavers from European caves in spore form on their clothes, on muddy cave boots and so forth, into American cave systems in the northeastern United States, so around eastern New England, for example. Geomyces destructans got a hold over there, jumped across the Atlantic in like the 80s and 90s, and immediately started bringing bat populations down to a fraction of a percent survival rate. Right? So think of 99.5% of all of the forestry students all got the same fungal infection and died basically immediately. We have one student left. That's what these bats are facing all across the United States right now because of recreational and project caving, hopscotching those spores from one cave where it gets established on the bats and other creatures, and on to the next one, and on to the next one. And some bat species are carrying it unknowingly from cave to cave. Among those species that do bounce from cave to cave, others are very more prone to staying in a particular cave system or not. Okay? Excuse me. So, here in the southern Midwest, we have the Ozark big-eared bat, we have gray bats, Indiana bats, and they were experiencing up to that 99+% fatality from Geomyces destructans. And so for them, this sort of like a white fuzz, peach fuzz, kind of grows on their faces, especially around their mucous membranes. So imagine if just like the outer edges of your eyelids and the outer edges of your lips, your anus, right, your genitals and so forth. Imagine if those were just a little bit itchy all the time. This is exactly what Geomyces destructans. It doesn't like directly poison them and they just like die writhing on the floor or anything like that. But as you're familiar, many bats have to undergo torpor or wintertime hibernation to bring their calorie consumption down, to put their bodies on a minimum metabolic rate to support life for a period of months while their primary food source, flying insects, is not available. And so they get this sort of slight burning sensation in their ears, on their faces, etc. And again, it's not poisoning them, it's just itching them a little bit, so they wake up from that torpor and kind of scratch a little bit. And they try to go back to sleep. Wake up again and scratch over here. And they end up starving to death by the end of wintertime because they're not completely in that torpor from like September to March or October, November to January, February, whatever the particular latitude's torpor calendar looks like. Okay? So it's just causing them to not quite have enough calories. Imagine starving to death from jock edge. This is literally exactly what they're doing. Now, once it does work its way through a cave population, any surviving bats typically are more resistant to it. The problem doesn't go away, but they're the hardiest individuals out of that population are able to begin repopulating that place, but in some cases the population just collapses. So this is a really, really, really big deal. This is judged to be an impact primarily of humans recreating in caves. It can migrate naturally, but it certainly didn't migrate naturally across the Atlantic in the first place. So this is a problem that we collectively all brought upon ourselves, not you and me in this room, right? This started before most of us were born. But it is an issue. And so where the impact is intense, right? Another one of our sort of management rules of thumb or handy little laws for this class, where the recreation pressure or impact is intense, the management therefore needs to be equally as intense. So we have a clear and direct response to that: cave gates. They are ugly as sin and they work okay. This is not stopping Geomyces destructans. This is typically being done in cave systems where we've already found it or where we think we're going to find it, we just haven't had a chance to look there yet, right? It is a huge amount of effort to build these out in the wild. Some of these are being built underground and so forth, but the whole idea is to keep humans out and to space those angle iron bars just wide enough, calibrated to the frequency of the specific species of bat that live there, so that, like, kind of how, you know how your microwave at home has that little grid of holes? Those holes are specifically sized for the frequency of those microwaves to be exactly big enough to let visible light out, but not to let those microwaves out so they're not like flash boiling your eyeballs, okay? And you can watch your ramen boiling over in your microwave. This is the same kind of thing. So the ultrasonic or high frequency echolocation calls of the bats that they use for navigation and to find food and so forth, those bars are sized for the frequencies of the bats so that they can fly through and not get disoriented and think this is like a solid cover to their habitat, and they can fly through just fine. Humans cannot. And this is typically uncoated angle iron so that we have sort of that natural rust or patina. This is the cave gate equivalent in terms of color matching to slathering all that graffiti with mud sourced from that cave in the room where the graffiti is, which is color matched to the rock right there, because that mud is former rock from that cave room, and so forth. Okay? So, this is horrendously difficult and frustrating and expensive to do, but this is absolutely what speleologists and cave mammalogists have figured out. We got to do this to not just we can't stop the spread of Geomyces destructans, but we can slow it down. And we can sort of flatten out the curve, like with COVID, for example. If a population gets a single inoculum, a single spore of Geomyces destructans, it takes a much longer time for that Geomyces destructans to work through that bat population and gives a much higher chance for survival for the bats in that particular cave system, because not all of them are getting it all at once with a huge initial dose. Just like you stand a much better chance of surviving COVID if most everybody is masking or vaccinated and or staying home, so that the emergency rooms don't get overwhelmed, right? We can treat the severe side effects of COVID, the severe pathologies of it, but we don't have enough ventilation systems to put everybody who gets COVID and gets real sick on it onto those ventilation systems. So to the extent that you can flatten that curve, was the language used by COVID epidemiologists. This is the same thing on behalf of the bats. Really hard work, but again, that's just how it goes in cave management. So, bats have a strong habitat dependency. We have habitat generalists in wildlife habitat management, right? So large cats, puma, mountain lion, catamount, same species, different common names. They're habitat generalists. We can find them all across the United States. They're highly mobile. A single adult male mountain lion can cover hundreds of miles in a season to get from one place to another, and cover, dozens to hundreds of different specific ecosystems and habitats along the way to get where they're going. Same thing with mature brown and black bears. Even a bear who has adapted to eat human food and will come back to the garbage pile or the Turons who feed them or whatever. If we tranquilize them and bust them a couple of 100 miles, they'll cross that a couple of 100 miles to get back to that same dumpster where they know that food is. So bats are at the opposite end of the habitat dependency spectrum, right? We can't substitute magically another just synthetic cave system for all of these bats. They are obligated to use those specific habitats because they are warm enough, those caves are warm enough through the winter that they can survive, okay? So timber nesting bats that, for example, can hang out in shagbark hickory, or at least mature shagbark hickory, we've got some options for them, right? We can plant shagbark hickory. We can build bat houses that mimic that particular shagbark sort of bark foliation pattern or size or curvature to create those microhabitats synthetically. We can't do that for cave bats, not really. So, a lot of our biggest cave systems, a lot of our most core habitat cave systems are in the National Park Service in terms of protection and management. So, if you're into bats, you might end up working with the National Park Service or for the National Park Service doing the specific stuff. And we do a lot of science intensively on National Park Service run cave systems because it's a preeminent science organization across the world, because this is the obligate habitat, and we can get a lot of good science done and a lot of good management done as a result of that. Another thing that we have to keep in mind with bats relative to forest recreation management is this idea that, well, a cave is a pretty nice recreation habitat for humans in the middle of winter. It's also core, necessary, unsubstitutable habitat for bats trying to sleep all winter long. Not just sleep, but be in that torpor, right? So, what is it, like down to a couple of heartbeats per minute kind of thing? Like almost just hovering at the edge of death. So they're spending very few calories to make it through that winter. And so when you're running thousands of cave tours through Mammoth Cave, the 4 to 8 miles of cave system that all of those tours run through, that's all habitat sacrifice zone for bats. Remember, there's over 400 miles of cave habitat connected to Mammoth Cave cave system, connected through Mammoth Cave National Park, which is only itself about a 6 mile by 6 mile rectangle in space. So in 6 miles of planar surface, 400 miles of cave system. And the Park Service runs visitors across up to about 8 miles of that, depending on the year. Right? So 98% of the cave system available to bats. 2% of the cave system available to humans. Is that like speciesist against humans in favor of bats? Yeah, maybe. But man, those 8 miles sure are pretty sick. And relatively few people come away from even just that tiny single-digit percentage of the experiences available at Mammoth Cave National Park. Almost nobody comes away from that thinking, oh, this place is fake and gay. This is like 1-star Yelp review, kind of a response to it. Even that 2% of the system is amazing for humans. It's like mind-blowing, right? So, we have really good things to do here. By limiting humans, using that least acceptable management strategy in a place that has to be extremely intensively managed for the safety of the bats and the survival of the humans, it's okay. The National Park Service has installed those walkways. It's installed multiple flush toilet bathrooms, 75, 80 feet underground. There's a full-size cafeteria down there. There are 2 elevators, and we've done it all in 2% of the cave system. And it's amazing, right? It's a world-class experience to go to Mammoth Cave and to enjoy that. It's wonderful. It works out pretty well. Okay? So, all that to say, we now know what the resource is. We can guess pretty easily why people want to be in a cave system to enjoy it, and what might be done